Couple housekeeping things. Because this is being recorded and because Nate and I have a massive amount of content, we're going to ask that you hold questions until the end, and if we don't have time at the end, that you write down your questions and get them to us through whatever means. Scribble them on a piece of pew pad paper and shove them in my pocket as I walk by after church. I don't care how. And we will try to include answers to those questions in the coming 6 weeks, because this is a 7-week thing. And there's a good chance that any question you'd be asking at the beginning is probably in week 3 or week 6 or week 7. I'd also ask you, for those of you who don't know this space well, to be very careful about the back doors, because they're the loudest doors on the planet. And so feel free to walk through one that's already open if you got to get up, or very gently open it and close it and hope it doesn't go and drown out the back row for a while. Also, if you have to take a phone call, you probably don't want to do it right on the other side of that glass and plastic wall, because that glass and plastic amplifies sound instead of keeping it out. And so we don't really want to know about your gallbladder unless you want us to know about your gallbladder, and then we'll pray for you happily. Just a few housekeeping things there. We will have recordings, hopefully video, if not audio. And if your idea of a really great class is everybody sitting in a circle and sharing their perspective, this is not going to be fun for you, because Nate and I have a lot of content, and this isn't really a discussion. It's really us trying to map out, as two people who have written extensively on this topic, who these people are we're talking about and how we love them. This is not a Christian ethics class, though we're going to talk a lot about Christian ethics. This is a class about sexual and gender minorities and the gospel. And so it's really a class about people, as well as about Christian ethics, as well as about evangelism, because we're here to bring the welcome of Jesus to all people, and that includes LGBTQ people. So I think that's all I have. I want to start with a story. This is from Bill Henson's Guiding Families of LGBT Loved Ones, which is probably the best resource for a pastor or a parent when somebody comes out to you, particularly a youth or a child. It's the best resource you can get from an Orthodox Christian perspective that's also missiologically savvy and pastorally sensitive. This is from Kenny. Kenny was age 23 when he wrote this. Kenny says, I started getting bullied in 3rd grade at my Christian school. With my personality and interests, other boys didn't see me as one of them. I was quiet and sensitive, while the other boys to me just seemed messy and aggressive. I felt more comfortable interacting with girls. I liked the mature conversations that I could have with them. The middle school years were the worst. Through middle school, the bullying progressively worsened. Going through puberty, I realized I was sexually attracted to guys. Now I knew why my peers were bullying me. In the class where the bullying was most severe, the teacher saw what was happening and never intervened, leaving me feeling helpless to find relief. I started cutting class to avoid the bullying, only to end up getting detention. And at that point, I had no choice but to tell my parents about the bullying, and I was so embarrassed for them to know that it was happening. Kenny's mom says, we knew that middle school had been really tough for Kenny, but we only recently learned that the bullying had begun years before that. During middle school, Kenny wrote us a letter pleading with us to let him go to public school instead. Seeing his anguish, we agreed. Once he moved over to public school, Kenny was entirely free of mistreatment. Kenny writes, technically, I never really came out. My parents found out when I was 10 years old, when my mom found me doodling a heart containing the name of a boy I liked in my class. I'm actually really thankful that my mom found the note. It allowed me to process this struggle with my parents' support, even from an early age. My parents didn't make the mistake of panicking. They acted in faith rather than fear. They trusted God, which allowed them to be patient, to accept me, and to nourish faith in me. I knew early on that my identity was founded on who I am in Christ. The feelings were strong, but they never really defined me. Kenny's dad says, I didn't have any suspicions about Kenny's sexuality. I liked that Kenny represented males as gentle people. When we found this note, though, it hit me hard. As a pastor, I tend to take it in hard news and process it right away. Pastors fall apart unless we take our lives to God and let him walk us through it. We couldn't ignore this note, though, so I prayed, and I followed my wife's lead. She opened the door to conversation, and I walked through it with her. That was when I expressed to Kenny, I am not ashamed of you. I love you, and I'm so proud of you. We wanted him to have reassurance. Mom says I had concerns well before we found the note. As a Christian parent, I didn't give those suspicions much credibility, partly as an attitude of faith, but also because I didn't want it to be true. But then I found Kenny's journal. I read the words in my boy's handwriting. Dear Jesus, there is a boy. I think I love him. Please help me, Jesus. I don't want these feelings. Reading this, I could no longer live in denial. Kenny's struggle was real. The letter was too raw for a 10-year-old to express. I feared how my son would walk through his life this side of heaven. As we talk about LGBT people, you may not agree with everything that Nate and I are going to say, and that's okay. We're here to try to weave together a biblical vision of sexuality and gender with the compassion and the mercy and the heart of Jesus for people. And so that's our goal. I can't guarantee we'll do it perfectly, but we have done a lot of research on this topic. And so I think I can communicate that what we're going to be sharing is pretty reliable. Nate, why don't you walk us through who we're talking about?
Yep. Morning, everybody. So, who are we talking about? So right now, I'm thinking of the most common way to think about it would be the acronym that we all know and hear about, LGBTQ, I, A, and then it continues.
LMNOP.
Yeah. So, I want to go through each of those letters and just give a quick introduction. And just to introduce that idea, what we're talking about is the way our culture around us, our society, has organized these kinds of relationships or these kinds of motivations to form these kinds of relationships or to form or adopt this kind of an identity of sorts. We all have various kinds of identity. But so what I'm talking about right now is the way that our culture has shaped the way we think, for good or bad, for maybe neither, just descriptive. So I'm not talking about a biblical assessment of these terms or these words. I'm mostly trying to just get us all on the same page so that when you hear these words in just our larger society, you know what's being talked about. Some of them are obvious in the sense that, we talk about them, we hear about them. So the first would be L, lesbian. A lesbian is a woman who is drawn to the beauty of another woman, typically in a way that is inevitably experienced in the realm of sexuality. Likewise, gay is a term for a man, typically, although it also is used for women as well, for a man who is drawn to the beauty of another man in a way that makes, inevitably there's some sort of sexual element to that. Bisexual, very obviously, is someone who is drawn to the beauty or drawn to the beauty of both men and women. In a lot of cases, it's more of a fluid, experiencing more of a fluid sense in that. Skipping over into the T, we're switching from perception of beauty and experience of sexuality to actually who am I as an individual, particularly what gender am I? And so transgender people think of themselves as the opposite gender, the other gender. So a lot of times from very early on, they will think, wow, I don't really feel like I'm the gender I was assigned at birth. And there's a lot of angst, a lot of just uncertainty about what that looks like. The word queer is different. It's more of a it's a postmodern term, and so if you think about postmodernism is a word that we use to describe, rejecting of standards, rejecting of binaries, either or. Things have to be in boxes. Queer is wanting to push the boundaries of whatever box you feel put in. So whether that's the box of heterosexuality, so like maybe you don't feel like you want to be in that box, you want to stretch the boundaries of that box, then that's what queer is designed to think about. If you think about the term genderqueer, you may have heard that as well. That's also the idea of what are the gender boxes that I feel put into, or that people feel put into, and what are ways that they feel like they may want to stretch the boundaries of that box. So the term non-binary is related to that as well. So if there's people who don't feel like they want to be put in the box of man or woman, they feel that's too constricting for the way they think of themselves, then they would identify as non-binary, and that's a form of genderqueer. Another word that you'll hear is kind of in a different realm, the term intersex. Intersex is a medical term, really, that describes about 15 to 20, I don't know what the number is, 15 to 20 different medical conditions that a fetus basically can show early on in development, where the genetics don't actually lead to a clear final result of being either male or female. So there's a variety of genetic conditions. Sometimes one of the chromosomes is missing, one of the sex chromosomes is missing. So instead of XY, they'll describe it as XO, and the O stands for the missing X or Y chromosome. Sometimes a really interesting scenario is when you have an XY, so genetic male, but for some reason the brain early on in the fetal development is not able to recognize the male hormones that eventually begin developing. And so, part of biology is all fetuses will develop into females unless acted upon by hormones. All fetuses are surrounded by a woman's DNA because they're in the uterus, and so they're continually awash in female hormones. And so all fetuses will develop into female unless a Y chromosome is present to then kick off the masculinization of the fetus. And so what happens when the brain can't recognize those masculine hormones? So even though you have an XY chromosome, the baby will develop into a person that looks like a woman. And typically, that's another scenario. So that's one example of intersex conditions. So there's a lot of other ones, and they're interesting as well. There's asexual. Some people just don't experience strong sexual desire ever. And when our society organizes the idea of coupling, finding that special person, but it emphasizes it in a way that elevates sexuality and the presence of whether sexual desire is present. For people who don't experience sexual desire, it can be really unnerving to think, okay, well, how do I find this person that I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life with and live happily ever after with? So this idea that sexuality is a necessary experience for all humanity is something that is not true for everybody. There's another word, aromantic. A lot of times you'll hear aro-ace go together. Aromantic, arosexual, so it's a short term for each of those. Some people just don't experience that butterfly feeling, or they don't want to experience it, or they don't, it's a foreign experience to them. And so if romanticism is this idea that we think of as necessary to lead to, ultimate happiness, some people just don't experience that. They don't have that desire. And so that's where the aromantic term comes from. So there's several others. They're all, again, we're not talking about whether these terms are right or wrong, whether they're biblical or unbiblical. They're all terms that are describing a phenomenon in our culture today that is particularly meaningful to the people around us. And so I think for that reason alone, it's important for us to understand them and to know the kinds of experiences that they're reflecting, because those are the words that people use to make sense of their experiences. I'll hand it over to Greg now.
Sure, thank you, Nate. Just to qualify, there are people who the culture would identify as LGBTQ who do not identify as LGBTQ. For example, I remember years ago working with an HIV educator who worked primarily in St. Louis City, and he said he rarely used the term gay in talking with men trying to help them to practice safer sex, because he said, particularly in inner city Black communities, very often Black men who are sexually involved with other men do not think of themselves as gay. And so the language that was used is MSM, short for men who have sex with men. Similarly, in Christian circles and Mormon circles, in socially and religiously conservative circles, there's language that came out of the ex-gay movement during the early 2000s of same-sex attraction. There's a time in which I would have told you, I'm not gay, I just struggle with unwanted same-sex attraction. And every non-Christian in the room would have said, that is really weird, because aren't those the same thing? But it's a way that a lot of people in conservative spaces and Christian spaces use language to give you a clue that they're not treating their sexuality as an identity to celebrate, but just as a struggle to fight with. And so, you know, that's other people who might use different language. There are also certain language that certain women use where they don't think of themselves as lesbians, but they are women-loving. And so I want to distinguish the people we're talking about from the use of the label, because people will use different labels depending on their context to describe themselves. There is, however, some terminology that I want to encourage you not to use. You know, obviously any epithet like, you know, I don't appreciate it when a PCA elder referred to me online as a faggot. That's obvious. You know, that was not cool. That was not loving. Anything like that is obviously out of place. But a lot of times when people have questions in this area, they're afraid to ask because they're afraid they're going to use the wrong terms. And so I'm just going to point out some unhelpful terms. Since the 1990s, it has been considered insensitive to use the word homosexual as a noun. You know, in the 1970s, 80s, homosexual just meant a group of people who have certain orientation. Today, it's considered, really for the last 30 years, it's been considered socially insensitive because homosexual has, as language, it has a history in criminology and in psychology that defined sexual orientation as a mental illness, a psychiatric condition. And so in general, it's best just not to use that term as a noun. You can use it as an adjective describing something, but people will take offense or feel slighted if you use it as a noun. Another word that was used a lot 30 years ago that you don't really hear today is the word transvestite. I assure you, no one on the planet wants to be called a transvestite. You know, it sounds kind of like a vampire or something, you know. So I'd also avoid cross-dresser unless you're simply describing a behavior pattern that somebody likes to do dress up or something. A phrase that I used to use a lot because in the 1970s and 80s it had a meaning, but today generally does not, is the phrase gay lifestyle. In the 1970s, 80s, gay was often used to describe people with a certain ethic, specifically people who were you know, all about the rainbow flags and the sexual, you know, promiscuity and, you know, bathhouses and whatnot. And that was the gay lifestyle of heavy sex with all sorts of people of the same sex. But today, the term gay, particularly if used by anybody under about age 50, is used almost exclusively as the opposite of straight to describe a sexual orientation or propensity, not a lifestyle. I would also point out many don't like the term sexual preference because it sounds to them like you're in Baskin Robbins and there are 31 flavors and you're trying to figure out which one you like. What's your preference? That was language that was used in Rome, you know, 2,000 years ago. This is not a new experience. But you know, John Stott, the Protestant Pope, according to the BBC, in his writings really starting in the late 70s and then written down in the early 80s, he talks about how when you're talking about same-sex orientation, you're talking about something, you know, our sexuality is not the core of our being, but it's fairly deep inside. It's a part of our identity, he said, a part of our constitution. Not a core to our identity, but a part of that. And so we want to be sensitive to the fact that we're talking about people and that this is a significant part of their experience of being human in a post-fall world. Also, it's best not to talk about the gays. Because there are a lot of people who are gay, and they don't function as a gestalt being with one kind of hive mind that they're all a part of. You know, there's a lot of variety here. You know, do you know what percentage, you know, when I was growing up, they say, you know, LGBT people were, you know, the LGBT activists would always say, we're 10%, citing Kinsey studies from the 40s that were flawed, and conservative Christians would always say, no, you're 1%, because that was the number of people who self-identified as LGBTQ. And I remember that battle today among high school students in North America, in the United States. The percentage of high school students who identify as LGBTQIA is, and this is according to both federal government studies of all students individually identifying, as well as private polling from, you know, really respectable sources. What do you think the number is? It's 25%. 25%. A lot of that is a heavy increase in the number of teen girls identifying as bisexual, as well as a lot of people saying they're not sure. And so it's 1 in 4 now. So, you know, if you're a student, you probably have friends who are gay, bisexual, trans. You certainly have friends who have friends. It's just so pervasive today. And so we're talking about a large group of people. I also don't like to talk about this particular group as being sexually broken unless I'm talking about humans after puberty who are sexually broken, because sexual brokenness is not just something that a gay person or same-sex attracted person experiences. It's something that everybody experiences. We're all this side of the fall. And I mean, you can be in a monogamous marriage for 30 years and have sexual brokenness, your own or your spouse's, weighing so heavily upon you, you feel like you can't breathe. So everybody's sexually broken. Now, for some people, there's a term that we use a lot that makes them feel very, very, very uncomfortable. If you went through conversion therapy, and there are about 1 million of us who went through it in some form or another, if you went through conversion therapy, the phrase same-sex attraction might be traumatizing to you because it was something that you were told to use because you were told that if you just think this way, you will become straight. That this isn't part of who I am, it's just this disease that I have called same-sex attraction disorder, and if I go to a psychologist enough, or I go through the groups, or I disciple and pray enough, then I'll eventually become straight, and then they'll parade me out on the stage with my testimony, and out come my wife and children afterwards. And I've seen that testimony. I have plenty of friends who gave that testimony, but now that language of same-sex attraction can be traumatizing to some if they went through conversion therapy. And you can't really know somebody's sexual orientation, and you can't unless they tell you. I have a friend of mine who is a pastor in the PCA who is frankly the most effeminate man I have ever met in my life, and he has never had a homoerotic thought in his life. You know, you just can't know. You may suspect, but you can't know. Similarly, I remember first time I met Nate Collins, and I asked him what he did. It was in our sanctuary. He said, "Oh, I founded Revoice." And I thought it was so weird that a straight man founded Revoice. Because my gayometer did not light up at all. Not in the least. And so you really can't know. You know, and if somebody comes out to you as gay or whatever, you really only know that one thing about them. You don't know their political views. You don't know their theology. You don't know their sexual ethic. And you really don't want to make assumptions. I have a journalist friend of mine. His husband is an English guy, absolute dyed-in-the-mold conservative Republican, not what you think of as your typical LGBT person. But you really don't know much just because you know somebody's sexual orientation. Nate's going to share a little bit about thinking of LGBT people as a group, because when you think of them as an issue, then you're going to fight with them because America's a battlefield. If you think of them as a people group, then suddenly you got the Great Commission to deal with, and it's a question of how we evangelize these people, because America's a mission field instead of a battlefield. I remember my friend Bill Henson of Posture Shift. He was speaking in 2006, and there was a secular college event with a Christian message on sexuality. And writes, outside the auditorium, dozens of protesters gathered. Seeing their signs and sensing their frustration, I nervously approached them to ask why they were protesting. He listened to them. One student said, I grew up with 2 mothers. These evangelicals hate my family. A mother holding the hand of her son with special needs added, Christians keep trying to deny me access to my parents' health care or to my partner's health care that I depend on to care for my special needs son. After listening to many stories, Henson writes, my blind spots were revealed, and I saw my failure to love LGBT people. Out of that experience, he started a ministry, Posture Shift, to help Christians think through how to love LGBT people with the gospel. And he offers, in a list he titles Radically Love, he summarizes some of what it means to care for people. He says, offer enhanced inclusion, prove justice through your visible care, level the playing field, collaborate where you can, stay humble, resist the theological hammer, avoid trigger words and cliches, never lead with theology, because you wouldn't lead with theology with your straight neighbor who lives with his girlfriend. Avoid politics, he says. Posture Shift has privately trained about 80,000 Christian leaders at this point in how to have a posture of the gospel toward LGBT people. Nate, talk to us about the missiological question.
So yeah, one of the really helpful things about Posture Shift and what they've done, Greg mentioned it, but they really broke ground on thinking about what does it look like to think of the LGBTQ population or LGBT community as a people group. So when you think missiologically in terms of, what does it mean to be on mission with Jesus? What does it mean to pursue the building of the kingdom of God with LGBTQ people? And if you think about it missiologically, what Bill helped us realize is that it means you actually have to think about LGBT people as a people group. When we think about missions, we think, oh, what country am I going to? What are the people groups that are there? What's their culture? What are their values? What are the things that are really important, central to them? We educate ourselves about the people group before we go on mission to reach them. And so one of the things that Bill has really helped me, I remember going through that training, 7 years ago at this point. And so Bill really helped us understand what it looks like to think about the LGBT people as a people group. And one of the things, sadly, that features most prominently in LGBTQ experience is the experience of trauma. Now, I don't mean, if you're familiar with the X-Gay movement, we were taught to look for that thing that happened in our childhood, that traumatic event that then kick-started this process that led to me being gay or to someone being gay. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about trauma that gay people experience in culture at large and in churches because they're gay. It's just very, very widespread, and we're taught in some ways to not have this victim mentality and to really resist the idea of being victim-centered and everything. But I think when we do that with LGBT people, we really miss out on a centralized experience that a lot of people went through, and sadly, many of them go through that in the context of a church. I'm going to read this quote from Guiding Families. It says, for many decades, many but not all LGBT people have been treated as an issue to ignore, a problem to solve, a threat to fight, a danger to exclude, a person to preach at, an embarrassment to hide, a schoolmate to bully. Think about that story that Greg read from Kenny. He started out at a Christian school. That's where the bullying happened. And he begged his parents to let him go to a public school, and the bullying stopped. It's not the case for every public school. My kids go to public schools, there's bullying there. But it's just sad that that's a reality in Christian schools as well. LGBT people have been treated as an oddity to mock, a son to shame, a daughter to disown, a brother to abandon, a sister to reject. Again, without making blanket statements in terms of all LGBT people's experience, the experience of trauma, the experience of rejection, the experience of being treated as subhuman or subpar as a human is just very widespread in the LGBT community. And that's something to keep in mind as we're thinking about LGBT people as a people group. What are ways that we, as Christians, can tell the truth about our history as Christians, as evangelical Christians, whether we've personally done the treating, done the mistreatment or not, our people, our history, our North American evangelical history has. And so that's our history, and we need to own that, and we need to recognize that, and not be defensive if we encounter a gay person who identifies Christianity as abusive, for example. That might have been their actual real lived experience. And the tendency can be, well, not all people, not all Christians, not me certainly, but to be able just to sit there and receive that and not get defensive. When we get defensive, we basically say, well, your experience doesn't matter. Your perspective doesn't matter. What happened to you is just all in your head. But no, to realize, no, this actually happened, and the association with the bride of Christ, something that is so ultimately in the age to come is pure and is being made pure and holy, but right now is imperfect. And so we need to not be defensive with that. Greg? Keep it open.
Yeah, and there are risks that LGBT people experience, particularly as youth. There are reasons why in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, LGBT people all moved to cities where they could be around people just like themselves and not feel like fish out of water. LGBT youth are 2 to 4 times more likely to attempt suicide, and that's in families that accept them. In families that reject them, they're 4 to 8 times more likely than their peers to attempt suicide. They're 91% more likely to be bullied, 46% more likely to be victimized, 3 times more likely to skip school out of fear, and twice as likely to skip college. 20 to 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBT. 62% have attempted suicide. 59% of homeless LGBT youth have been sexually victimized. 94% of youth homeless shelters report serving LGBT youth in the last year. And 68% of homeless gay kids report serious family rejection. In evangelical families, LGBT youth are 85% say they felt uncomfortable coming out to their parents. 81% feared being viewed as disgusting by their family. 57% feared that their parents would disown them. 42% were thus then forbidden to tell anyone else by their parents. And 9% were literally kicked out of their homes. And so we're dealing with a lot of trauma, and a lot of trauma, frankly, even within Christian spaces, can sometimes be worse than better. Because I think sometimes when you're talking about gay people, you just assume that the gospel is somehow different for them. I'm not sure why, because my Bible says we're all sinners and that there's none righteous, not even one. But as you think about LGBT people and the church, realize it's complicated. Don't just think of radical activists, those few thousand people out there that make it in the news all the time. LGBT people are more likely than most to have been raised in a religious context. 96% of gays have prayed and asked God to make them straight. 96%. They often feel they need to hide or else they'll be ostracized. Think of the same-sex attracted kid in a fundamental Baptist church where he's told that Romans 1 teaches that it's because of his own sin that God handed him over such that he cannot be saved. I've had really well-meaning people say things to me not realizing what I might be hearing. And they say, well, Greg, I realize you struggle with same-sex attraction, but that doesn't mean God's going to leave you there. Okay, what do you hear? Hope. No, what you hear is, Greg, if you prayed more, fasted more, tried harder, read your Bible more, then you would be straight by now. Because God wouldn't leave you there. It's a expectation of sanctification that's different from what we say to everybody else. You know, a 25-year-old guy who struggles with lust, we're not going to say, well, that's where you are now, but God's not going to leave you there. No, you're going to be struggling with lust when you're 87 years old. It doesn't go away. Octogenarians tell me it doesn't go away. You might get a better handle on it. But, you know, temptation doesn't go away for anyone else. You know, I've heard people say, you can't be gay and be a Christian, you have to choose. And I know what they're trying to say. What they're trying to say is, you can't live an unrepentant life and be a Christian. You have to choose to follow Christ or not. But that's a way that gay was used 40 years ago, not how it's used today. Today, what anybody will hear is, if you experience same-sex attraction, the gospel does not apply to you. Jesus did not save you. You can't be gay and be a Christian. And it ends up shutting the door to the kingdom. And this is coming from really well-meaning people, but there's a language divide that gets in the way. Sometimes LGBT people get confused because their churches tell them things that their last church didn't tell them or that are different. They might go to one church that tells them, yeah, you can do whatever you want, follow your heart. And another church that says, no, people like you are disgusting. And then another church that's hopefully preaching the gospel to them. And they sometimes wonder, well, which of these is true? I'm hearing these different voices from the church. Statistically, LGBT people are far more likely to go to a non-affirming church that holds to the traditional biblical sexual ethic than they are to an open and affirming church. They often feel more comfortable, even though it's socially isolating, in a church that actually preaches the Bible. I'll just note, it takes some courage to come out in a conservative religious context. And I remember one pastor friend of mine whose teenage son told him he was gay, and the pastor friend came to me and said, I don't think he's really gay. I think he just said that because he was mad at me and he wants to make me feel bad. And I remember looking at him and saying, when you were 15 years old, would you have told your dad that you were gay to get back at him? No, I think you need to go take care of your son because he's just done the most traumatizing, scary thing of his life. And the likelihood, you know, it's probably not a phase. He's probably not going to grow out of it. He's just revealed something that he's probably known for 5 years and not told a soul. And he's wondering if you're going to reject him. Go talk to your son. Nate, talk to us about identity.
Yeah, so we've looked at LGBT people and this idea of thinking through the lens of missiology. What does it look like to be on mission? Greg just talked about LGBT people and the church. So what it looks like to think about, just experience in the church. What about LGBTQ people and identity? That's this hot topic. Well, the question is, why identify? I remember for me, I have gone through virtually every possible way to identify this aspect of my life. I don't remember this, but my dad tells me I remember the conversation, but I don't remember the words that came out of my mouth. My dad says, I told him when I was 19 years old, Dad, I think I'm a homosexual. And I just cringe right now when I think about that. And I've gone from, struggling with homosexuality to struggling with same-sex attraction to, no, I just experience it. It's not a struggle all the time. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So I just experience it. And I remember thinking about, why don't I just say I'm gay? I remember asking Sarah, what would you think? My wife, Sarah, what would you think if I told you I was gay? She's like, well, that's what I've been telling my friends. And so I was like, oh, okay, there we go. So, but why identify? What does it mean to say this word is part of my identity? What it doesn't mean is that it's the central part of who I am, or it's the central part of how I think of myself. What's our central identity? What is the most deepest part of what's the deepest thing you can say about somebody? It's whether they belong to Jesus or not, whether they're united with Christ. Our spiritual identity as children of God is the deepest part of who we are as humans. So that is our core identity. Do we have other identities? I'm a Cards fan. Like, that's an identity. Society uses the word identity to describe a wide variety of ways that people think about themselves. They organize into groups. They find who their people are. So identity functions in a wide variety of ways. And so, people might be afraid of, well, what happens if, we let gay people say they're gay? Does that mean that they're going to, it's a slippery slope, right? No, we're just using the human language. We're just using language the way the human language works. I'm not going to get into that. I've talked about this difference between sociological identities versus a core gospel identity as children of God. There's also the reality that some people choose not to publicly identify, or the phrase coming out. Some people choose not to do that, and that is fine. My choice to identify should never be used by others to pressure other people into coming out. People who do not want to come out publicly should not feel pressured to do so. There's a wide variety of reasons why some people will choose not to be out publicly, and that is completely fine. That's just how some of us have chosen to live our lives. So, hand it back over to Greg.
Thanks, Nate. So, how do we love LGBT people well? I think we love them well the same way we love everybody else. And before you even really start asking how do we love people outside the church, I'd say first start with people inside the church. This is a church that has plenty of gay, same-sex attracted, trans, whatever people in it who are trying to walk with Jesus. Start loving the ones who are here. And start building that trust relationship so that it's a safe place for that to happen. It has to start inside the church. If 25% of high school students are identifying as LGBTQIA right now, start working with the youth group, college ministry. It's start inside the church with hospitality, with love, with compassion, with understanding, asking questions instead of leading with theology. Because the reality is, for those outside the church, LGBTQ people are sinners, just like the rest of us, and they need Jesus, just like the rest of us. And the gospel of salvation applies to them, just like the rest of us. Whoever will follow me, Jesus says. If you're going to follow him, salvation is for you. And that means we need more LGBT people inside the church, not fewer. I'm going to say that again, because it might have just rubbed you the wrong way, and I want you to make sure that, yes, I am saying that. LGBT people need Jesus. And that means we need more LGBT people in the church, not fewer, because we need them to meet Jesus and experience salvation and come to walk with him and wrestle through their gender and or sexuality with Jesus and his people following Christ. So, if a non-Christian or unchurched friend of yours tells you they're gay, at what point do you share your theology of sexuality with them? Well, I'll ask a different question. If your next door neighbor, who presumably might be sleeping with his girlfriend, introduces himself to you, at what point do you explain to him biblical sexual ethics? Well, when he asks you what you think. Because his basic need is for Jesus. His basic need is not to quit sleeping with his girlfriend. His basic need is Jesus. And when he gets Jesus, then he's going to start bringing his girlfriend or that relationship before Jesus and asking Jesus what he wants. And so I would caution not to lead with theology and realize that sometimes, even when somebody asks you a theological question, they're not really asking you a theological question. When somebody shows up on Sunday morning and says, Pastor Greg, what is your church's teaching on sexuality? I'm going to stop and say, I'm happy to talk about that with you, but I'm curious, what about your story leads you to raise that question? My parents kicked me out of their house, and they say if I go talk to Greg Johnson about sexuality, they'll take me back in. Okay. Here's somebody who's being abused, and I have a minister, as a minister of the gospel, which all of you are as well, we then have the opportunity to minister to somebody who is being abused and being mistreated by their family and being manipulated, and to offer them compassion and care and support. And that's going to do way more for the kingdom than front-loading a theology question when their theology question wasn't really a theology question. It was really coming from a place of hurt, and they're looking for care, or they're trying to do what they think they have to do to get somebody to take them back. So always ask questions before you lead with theology. And yet, at the same point, don't hide what you believe. It would be a mistake if they do ask you what you think to hide that fact from them. Nobody wants to start going to a church, build friendships, join the church, and then be told that, oh, now you have to do this, that, and the other. Like, they'd want to know that before they make the commitment. Help them count the cost, if that's the point they're at. How can we love people outside the church? Hospitality. Lead them the way Jesus won your heart. Jesus won your heart by getting down on his knees and washing your feet. In other words, as a servant, not as a Lord. That's how he won our heart, by dying for us when we were his enemies. Find ways to love your LGBT neighbor, to serve them, to love them, let them in, see if they let you in. I don't even particularly like the phrase coming out, because for me it's much more about letting people in, because it's easy to hide. And be prepared to ask forgiveness on behalf of church. If they've been abused by a church, be ready to say, I'm really sorry that happened. Show some empathy. Nate, you have any other thoughts on public posture stuff before I jump into kind of closing stuff?
Yeah, earlier Greg mentioned just the idea of starting with LGBT people in our own church. A lot of people come to me will ask me, well, how do I reach the LGBT community? Well, the problem is that when you go to the LGBT community as a North American evangelical Christian, you have they associate that with a certain posture. And they want to know that that posture is not going to be one of pride, of just being unaware of our history as a church with this issue. So the best way to change that is to shift your focus to your local church, and ways that your local church is loving and providing community and providing belonging. I'm married, but a lot of gay people don't end up marrying someone of the opposite sex for fairly obvious reasons. And so, but what does family look like for those individuals? What is belonging? This idea that you come first for somebody. That when you know that when you have a medical problem and you can't take care of yourself, that someone's going to actually be there to take care of you. These are all real human needs that we all experience, and that for a variety of reasons are typically met through a nuclear family, through a spouse, through extended family, for example. Gay people who don't get married have those needs. They don't go away. So what does it look like to be the family of God to those of us in the church like that? And so thinking of the making it a priority to provide that kind of care, to be that kind of sibling in the faith to LGBT people goes a long way to actually changing the cultural perception of Christians. There's a book called Is God Anti-Gay? And it's trying to address this idea that with a widespread perception among culture is that Christians are anti-gay, and therefore God hates gay people, and therefore Christians must be anti-gay. And that's something that's just not true. And yet, it's a very compelling narrative for non-Christians because of pain that a lot of LGBT people have experienced in the church. And so part of our job as Christians to love LGBT community starts by going out of our way to demonstrate that love to LGBT people in our community. And then once our communities are transformed, and then we can go out and we can take that message of the gospel to the culture at large.
So, something I'm going to answer every single week for the next 6 weeks, 7 weeks including, is what do you do if your child comes out to you? Because if you have one child, there's a 25% chance of it right now. If you have 4, the cards are stacked. It's likely to happen. You have to understand when a child comes out to their parents, it's probably the scariest thing they have done up to that point. And it may be, if they were not abused at some point, it may be the most traumatic moment of their life. And so obviously listening and then offering your love, you're recognizing that it takes a lot of courage to be your kid at that moment, to do what they just did, and to love them well, to let them know you're not ashamed of them, that you love them, and that what they just told you does not change how much you love them at all. The next thing you need to do is plan a follow-up conversation. A follow-up conversation. There are 2 mistakes. 1, you never mention it again. That's cruel. And 2, you talk about it all the time with them because you need to process it. And that's not fair to them, because that's communicating to them that the nature of sexual temptation that they experience is the most important thing about them, and that you have to address it. Schedule a follow-up conversation. During that follow-up conversation, you communicate to them, hey, you have lived years now without your mom and dad's support. And we are so sorry that we didn't know and we weren't there for you. We'd like to hear more about what that was like for you. And listen. Ask questions. Are you feeling or have you ever felt suicidal or about hurting yourself? Are you or have you ever been teased or bullied? How are your friends responding to you? How have people at church responded to you? Is there anything else you would like us to know right now? And then one of the most important questions, do you prefer that we share this with others or maintain your privacy? Because you can't out your child to other people. It's their decision who they share that information with. And so how do they want you to do that? And they have to think about that. And then after that follow-up conversation in which you do those 9 things, and I'm going to repeat them every week, and if you want them, I'm happy to let you make a photocopy because I'm reading here. After that, you start working on developing a care team. These are the people that your child will know that they can turn to with questions, for prayer, for support. They could be a pastor, a youth pastor, a counselor, a psychologist, a teacher, an uncle, a adult friend of the family, but a group of people, not just one, that they feel comfortable sharing with, that they have around them for their own health, because they've got all sorts of things to figure out. They're going to have to figure out where they are with Jesus at some point, what they think about the Bible, whether they want to serve him, just all this stuff you're going to want people around them that they can do that with. And these don't all have to be Christians. They don't all have to have the same perspective. The priority is that they're people that they feel safe processing with. Hopefully they're primarily Christians, but that's kind of where you want to go when that happens. First, offer compassion, then follow-up conversation, 9 questions, and then care or support team. Because there is within the experience of coming out, there is a basic human longing that's at work. We all long to be known, and we're all terrified of being known, and we all want to be loved for who we are and not have to wear a mask. And that coming out experience of saying, hey, this is something secret about me that I am disclosing, and I am looking for acceptance as a human being, that is the gospel cycle. That longing is something deeper than just a longing for acceptance from other people. That's a longing for acceptance from God, because we all have something defective about us that we both long to be known and are terrified of being known. And there is in that longing that's so central in the LGBT community, there's really a gospel longing at the heart of that. And let me just point out, as this first week we're just talking about who are LGBT people. This is more of a sociological class this morning. Next week we're going to look at a biblical vision for sexuality and gender and talk some about ethics and that kind of stuff. But just point out that when you look at the Bible, one thing you notice that's quite profound is that the first Gentile convert was a guy from Ethiopia, actually from Africa, probably Nubia. The Greek covered all of that, who was a eunuch, who had been sexually altered. And in particular, a eunuch, a desert eunuch, which that meant completely emasculated, nothing left to be circumcised, even if he wanted to become a Jew, who had been rejected at the temple, one, because he was a Gentile and there was no place for him anymore, and two, because he was probably a foot taller than everybody else and had dark skin, and they knew he was not Jewish. And then, Philip, a deacon, is literally supernaturally transported there or transported back. I can't remember all the details, but told to go hang out at this road. And then this Ethiopian comes and he's reading Isaiah 53 and wants to know, hey, is this Isaiah he's talking about or somebody else? And Philip's like, let me tell you, eunuch becomes a Christian. And does Philip then say, hey, we need to baptize you? No, he has to ask for baptism. Hey, here's some water, could I get baptized? People shouldn't have to do that, but he's being treated differently. He's a eunuch. He's a sexual and gender minority, Jesus said there are three kinds of eunuchs: those who are born that way, that's intersex conditions; those who are made that way by men, that's this guy; and those who choose celibacy for the sake of the kingdom. And then he's baptized, and it's only later that Cornelius, the Roman, converts. The first Gentile convert was a gender or sexual minority. The father of the Gentile church was a man who was incapable of having children himself, and yet he became the father of us all. That's the kind of God we serve, a God who takes the outsider and brings him in to include, a God who takes those who are racially, ethnically, nationally, sexually, gender-wise different from us and brings them in to follow Jesus. That's the kind of God we serve, a kind of God who's going to take a eunuch and make him the father of us all. Let me pray for us, and then I have to dart into the sanctuary to do mic check. But if you have questions, again, write them down, get them to us. We will try to answer them in future weeks. Father, thank you for gender and sexual minorities, Lord. We've all been affected by the fall in different ways, Lord, and there is none righteous, not even one. But we thank you and we pray, Father, for those who don't yet know your grace, that they would come to know you, and those who are coming to know you would learn how to follow you, and that you would give them family and hope in your church. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, guys. Yes. There's a newer version of it.